You're all very, very welcome to this event here at the Royal College of Nursing. This event that we're hosting tonight is the first one that we've done in person. So and we also have colleagues from across the world who will be joining us on line. I'm really pleased to welcome everybody here to this event. As I said, hopefully, if you haven't already done so, you'll be able to look at the exhibition that we have. I think some of our speakers are going to give us some of the historical background to care and support, and we know that language and terminology has changed massively over the past 50 years or more. So just to bear in mind that if any of the terminology that's used, it's been given within that historical context, and we so just to bear that in mind. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to move on to our first speaker, who's Dr. Bonnie Evans, who's a Senior Research Fellow at Queen Mary University here in London. She's also been a Senior Researcher at the Wellcome Trust, where she was involved in a project, Autism Through Cinema, that culminated in a publication of a book in 2017 that I think forms part of the basis of what she's going to talk about here, which is the Metamorphosis of a History of Child Development in Britain. I hope I've got that right, Bonnie, and if not, I'm sure that you'll be able to point out anything else. So thank you very much.
I actually did the Autism Through Cinema project after I wrote the book on the Metamorphosis of Autism. And that sort of developed out of the book. I worked with film producers and films were made, and that's there's more information about that online if you want to look that up. But today I'm going to be talking more about the book that I wrote on the history of autism, and I've added a little caveat there why it matters or why I think that it matters. I am a historian, so I will be using historical terms, but I am trying to bring these up to date and make these more relevant. Hopefully that will come across at the end of the talk. The book that I wrote, The Metamorphosis, was the... Oh yeah, are you doing the slide changes or...? Yes. Yeah. It essentially looks at how different models of society since the early 20th century have been reflected in different models of child development. And in this talk, I'm going to focus on why autism, and specifically autism, so not any other word or category or diagnosis, why is it that autism became such an important category for describing psychological differences amongst individuals, for thinking about differences amongst people. And why it's become really the most dominant psychological diagnosis in the 21st century. So as a historian, I've always been interested in how humans throughout history have been classed or classified in different ways. And one thing that you realize when you start to look historically at human classification is that psychological diagnoses have always ebbed and flowed at different times. So the classic one that everybody talks about is hysteria, which rose in the early 20th century and then declined. Anorexia diagnosis rise in the 1980s. And when these diagnoses begin to rise, people always begin to ask questions. Well, why does this rise take place? Why did it take place? And there are always intense discussions about it, particularly when it first starts to happen. Now, that doesn't mean that these aren't very important sort of descriptive terms or psychological terms. These are really important identities for people as well. And as a historian, I'm not interested in sort of invalidating or proving the existence of any diagnosis. I'm more interested in how diagnostic tools get and how resources and attention get employed and directed at certain places and certain times in history. So the autism diagnosis really began to take off substantially in the 1990s, particularly in the USA and in the UK. And from the 2000s, this level's been relatively stable, but you can see this huge increase that takes place. And now if you look at global studies, they're between 80 and 140 per 100,000. So they vary quite a lot, but they do stay within that range. And the classic now rate of autism is 1 in 100 that you'll see reported in many, many, many studies. Obviously, when that happened, people began to ask, well, has there always been autism and now we've just become more aware of it? Has psychology advanced now to such a degree that we're now able to classify, different people better than ever before? Will autism disappear like other categories? Or is there something that is very unique about autism? Has psychology really developed the tools to understand this more than anything else? Obviously, there are other explanations that were put forward at the time around vaccines. There were, many discussions around that haven't entirely gone away. So, but the truth is that it's incredibly difficult to pin down any definition of autism. So ever since the early 20th century, autism has been a device for thinking through the early stages of psychological development. And in the very early studies of autism in the early 20th century, it just means early thought. It means like the first thought that a child has before they engage in the world or have any, the world has any impact upon them. That's the early diagnosis. And this is the very first description of autistic thought by Eugen Bleuler, a Swiss psychiatrist, and he regarded it as sort of an early form of thought. He said it takes place in symbols, in analogies, in fragmentary concepts and accidental connections. And Bleuler, Sigmund Freud, and many other psychiatrists and psychoanalysts at this time understood autistic thought in this way. The US psychiatrist Leo Kanner is often credited with sort of creating the autism diagnosis in 1943, but a lot of the work that I've done has looked at how this diagnosis was actually being employed, not as a diagnosis, the category was being employed much earlier than that. Jean Piaget, who was a developmental psychologist in Switzerland, described many instances of autism. In his work, he described it as a kind of symbolic thinking in which visual imagery dominated an individual's thoughts and affected their ability to think in language logically and relate socially. And actually, Kanner's understanding was actually very similar to many of these earlier understandings. So when he put forward his paper in 1943, he was thinking about autism in cases. He was saying that children thought in this bizarre, fantastical way, which is how people used to describe it then. And he did try and claim it as a specific syndrome, but there were still many challenges to that at the time. And in parallel with this interest in early stages of thinking, psychologists in the early 20th century also became fascinated with tracking these sort of norms of development. This is a famous observational dome that was created by the US psychologist Arnold Gesell at Yale University. And as you can see, this is where sort of psychological interest moved. There's a little baby in the middle surrounded by psychologists, photographers, and others in their lab coats, but they all become fascinated with looking, well, what's normal? If you look at this child, what's the normal thing that a child of this age would do? What's a normal thing that a child of 6 months will do? So these are some, and he has thousands and thousands and thousands of these images and films, which is something that we were looking at in the film project, just trying to track these norms of development. So this is, in this example, he's looking at a child between 5 and 6 months and seeing if they have an object in front of them. Do they grasp it? Do they not grasp it? And so, but this becomes associated also with the IQ testing movement in psychology. But what's important to understand is that up until the sort of late 1950s and 1960s, these two approaches to child development developed kind of independently. So the Eugen Bleuler, Sigmund Freud, psychoanalysis, they gave voice to the experiences of the individual and were very interested in looking at particular cases. This was also at a time when like family ties were losing power, capitalism was expanding. They were very focused on individual sciences and individual cases. But the study of developmental norms, the development of intelligence testing was different, and that was looking at how to quantify and order human capacities and capabilities, and intelligence testing served more of a sort of bureaucratic objective of categorizing and sorting out children for an expanding education system at the time. And in the interwar period, many psychologists sort of understood the autism concept and would use it with the children that they were working with. But there was a large section of the population who it was assumed that sort of these kinds of psychological theories weren't relevant, and that was how, up until the 1950s, like psychological sciences were separated because of that. And I think if you looked at the exhibition downstairs, there is a section on mental deficiency law in the UK, which gets established in 1913. There are similar laws which are established all over the world, actually, most places in the world, that mean that institutional care settings are set up for children with what we would now understand to be learning disability. And this is Meanwood Park. This is Meanwood Park Colony. It was largely something that was taking place across Europe, the USA, that these institutions were being established. Inside, there was often an obsession with ordering and sorting and sort of regimenting. And in here, sort of staff were not so interested in the complexities of individual psychology. There wasn't the luxury, really, to explore that within these contexts at that time. This is just a map of the world from the 1930s that I wanted to just sort of point out a little bit. I mean, so in North America, the eugenics movement was incredibly influential. IQ testing was incredibly influential at this time. It meant that institutional care settings were set up en masse in this period. In the UK, across Europe, you also see it, Megan Vaughan and Sol Dubois, and there are many other historians who've written about the colonial context and how that impacted, care policies and practices in Africa and India. In South America, there was a big eugenics movement. So this was happening internationally, and the way that the psychological sciences were interpreted in these different places was having a big impact, which is why I think the history of autism is important. The history of what happens to the autism category is also important. Because it's hard to underestimate, really, the sort of influence of psychological theory at that time, and these ideas about what was then termed mental deficiency, which impacted the Mental Deficiency Act in the UK. Anyway, so after the Second World War, that sort of threw a huge spanner in the works of all these psychological theories and their development. Both Freudian psychoanalysis and intelligence testing and sort of the idea of developmental norms, they began to look quite shaky. The war sort of burst apart these psychological narratives. It raised new questions. Psychoanalytic ideals of individual progress were shattered as well. And of course, the spectre of Nazism made social divisions based amongst human types a politically toxic idea. And the idea of mental deficiency was rightly challenged at this time. The WHO, actually, World Health Organization, issued a statement in the early 1950s that said we must close down all the asylums, we must close down all of the institutions set up to manage this so-called problem of mental deficiency, which is how it was often described in many policy papers in the UK. And it was after this paper was published that this also had a massive impact on what happened with policy across the world in relation to learning disability and autism. This book is from, this is an image which is from a book from the late 1950s. And there were many discussions at this time around overcrowding that was taking place in these institutions. They were hugely overcrowded. The level of attention that each individual child could get was limited. Everything was, there were no resources, basically. And what the WHO were arguing was taken into account by many countries at this time, and they were eventually slowly closed down. Their ethos was everything about those places was challenged. But what's interesting is that from the late 1950s then and 1960s, we begin to see really, really different forms of psychological research. And what happens is the individual case studies, the psychoanalytic models of development that were being put forward in the early 20th century, and the IQ testing and the developmental norms type of research began to combine more in this period. And, what many people don't fully appreciate is the kind of enthusiastic zeal with which many people, many new autism researchers considered or put forward their work at this time in the 60s. And many people viewed it as incredibly progressive because it was a way to move past the sort of cruel eugenicist philosophies of the early period. And it went hand with a kind of zeal for social scientific measurement, progressive change, a movement away from what were considered, barbaric practices in the 30s to the 50s. And autism researchers of the 60s, they had to sort of create this whole new paradigm of human development. And it meant that they couldn't draw from psychoanalysis, really, because it wasn't useful to them. They couldn't draw from IQ testing, it wasn't useful to them. So they had to build new kind of models or ways of thinking around how you classify people, in particular children. And this is just a quote from William Compton Carr. The most exciting thing which is happening, it's a frontier to be crossed, this work on autistic. And at the time, these were the other categories that were basically used in parallel with autistic schizoid psychotic children. They had very few terms to use around this, and those were the ones that they used. So what happened was there's a group of psychiatrists, child psychiatrists in the UK, and actually all of the global autism research which develops a lot of it does originate in the UK. So the British context is interesting because of that. In the 1960s, Victor Lotte conducts the first ever epidemiological study of autism in the UK. He derives what he argues is that in order to do an epidemiological study, in order to make arguments to government that we need to support particular individuals in new ways and not in the old institutional care way, but in new ways, is we need to understand, or we need to be able to count all of these children first of all. So their early attempts to count are, based on behavioral categories, and there are so many discussions that take place around this time about how can we do this. So Mildred Creek is the first psychiatrist who sort of develops this list of what constitutes schizophrenic syndrome in childhood or autism, and the most debated aspect of that was apparent unawareness of his own personal identity, because that was supposed to be a key concept. Well, then they would argue, well, how can we actually measure this? But Victor Lotte thought that it was possible, and he developed this list of behavioral categories, which he said correlated with that, and this was the first epidemiological study. So things like speech not useful to communication, reversal of pronouns, in social behavior, visual avoidance, solitary, ignores children, aloof and distant, and then movement categories, self-spinning, jumping. But, if you are developing any kind of population study, of course, you have to develop these kinds of similar behaviors, but whether or not they were actually kind of capturing the reality of what was happening psychologically or what was going on in the minds of these children who were being classed in that way is another thing, but it was that was what happened. And in this attempt to count autism, this actually, so the Metamorphosis of Autism, the theory that I wrote about in the book, it changes the meaning of autism. So prior to the 1950s and 60s, autism is a kind of visual category. There's often a lot of talk around fantasies and illusions and all these things. It's just how people thought about other people's thought at that time. But by the later 20th century, there's a real emphasis on this impairment model, but it was the impairment model of autism that drove a lot of the sort of social changes that we see here. The National Autistic Society set up schools for autistic children. The first autistic school is established by Sybil Elgar in 1965. You see similar things happening across the USA. Lots of these schools are being established, but they're being established because you have this diagnosis or this category that means that we can develop new ways to think about child development. So by the 1970s, all large sort of state-run mental deficiency institutions have been shut down, and the new generation of autism psychologists started to argue that, you know, they knew what was needed. You can see in 75 still, this is the number of children labelled with autism, but this just rapidly increases later. And it was in this social and political climate that Judith Gould and Lorna Wing conducted the first, conducted the sort of landmark study, which was then used in DSM-3 to diagnose autism, and it was a sort of benchmark study, and that's when Lorna Wing came up with the idea of the autistic spectrum. It was via this study that the sort of diagnosis autism really expanded. What is interesting is that the autism diagnosis unit from the 60s to the 90s, it grew up, in a way, it was a sort of resistance to a neoliberal agenda. It was a way of sheltering certain people from the challenges of global capitalism. And in the years since, it's become sort of important means for affirming identity, political identity, as well as personal identity, and that's how, you know, that explains the growth of the neurodiversity movement as well. And the diagnosis really gained a foothold at the end of the 20th century because it ensured special educational needs to autistic individuals. It slotted neatly into new models of social and economic liberalism in the 80s and 90s that sort of aspired to dismantle social welfare in terms of a broad sense, but enabled it in terms of a specific sense. And you know, it should be no surprise then that the most kind of unwavering support for autism diagnosis kind of grew up under Thatcher and Reagan because they prepared or they sort of protected certain citizens, and that was part of this. That's part of this history. But it is also, you know, this impairment model of autism that was employed in many studies worldwide. And in the last kind of 10 to 15 years, there's been an increase in studies of autism, ADHD, other developmental diagnoses across the world. The World Health Organization, the World Bank have argued it's vital to sort of creating functioning economies now to understand what autism and what is still classed as in different ways in other countries, how we understand this is important to creating functioning societies. So just to conclude then, I think I'm running up to the end. Historically, the autism category, it's been a very significant category within the psychological sciences since the early 20th century. It became associated with this sort of enthusiasm for social change after the Second World War. And it served as an important tool for sheltering certain people. And the neurodiversity movement, it's also served a very significant role in highlighting sort of political needs of the autistic population. And we are moving into, because of the autism diagnosis, we are moving into a new sort of way of understanding how, you know, we relate socially, everybody interacts in a more in a very different sense to these earlier models that you see in the early 20th century.